Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Briana Doering. Brie's an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming, specializing in the archaeology of the vast Alaskan interior. In particular, she's an environmental archaeologist, studying the relationship between hunter-gatherers and the natural world. In this conversation, we focus on one research topic, the Dene Transition, a pivotal moment of change more than 1,000 years ago, when people speaking Na-Dene languages, such as Navajo and Western Apache, migrated out of Alaska, the Yukon, and British Columbia, eventually settling as far south as the border of Mexico. At its time, this was one of the most important events taking place on the whole of the continent, and yet most people have never even heard of it. So, without further ado, my name is Sebastian Weatherby, and this is The Tell. Well, hi Brie, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So I guess I wanted to start by asking what kind of archaeologist you see yourself as.
That's such a great question. I just recently received an award at the University of Tübingen for my dissertation research, and they specifically asked me what I considered myself because they had to introduce me in this very formal way. And they said, would you consider yourself just an anthropological archaeologist because you seem to do so many different things? And I said, yeah, I guess that's kind of where I situate myself. I also identify as an environmental archaeologist. I'm really interested in understanding how people and their environments change together through time, and mostly using any means possible to better understand that, from bones to isotopes to tiny pieces of lithic material.
Yeah.
So
that's something I think that's especially important working in Alaska, because compared with some parts of the world where a lot of very big and very visible things tend to get left behind by people, it's one of those places where you have to kind of use a fine-toothed comb to get at a whole lot of information, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think, so when I first started working in archaeology, I did my field school in Central Alaska, mostly out of convenience because I'm from Alaska and I would go home during the summers. And the University of Alaska Fairbanks offered a very good field school at Ben Potter's dissertation research site called Gerstle River. And as part of that, I just decided to go. And as you say, the archaeological material there is pretty, what's a good way of putting it? It's pretty limited, and just because of the nature of mobility in that environment, also preservation. And then I went on to work in several different regions. I worked in Mexico, I worked in Madagascar, I worked in these places because I was really interested in really making sure that I wanted to work in Alaska.
Yeah.
And the thing that actually kept bringing me back was the fact that so many pieces of the puzzle seemed to be missing. And you had to become really creative to answer any questions that you had about how people used to live.
Yeah, I've worked on a dig in Belize where any artifact smaller than, say, a quarter, you would just toss. Unless it was like a piece of jade or something like amazing. It's like a chunk of pottery. It's trash.
Yes.
And I had a really hard time with that, coming from, working with hunter-gatherers on the plains and places that are you have to be a lot more meticulous, but it just goes to show how different the task is depending on where you are.
Absolutely, and how, your objectives, what you're looking for, change so much. Yeah, absolutely true. I remember when I was working in Oaxaca in Mexico, showing the workmen, who were all very experienced in field archaeology, showing them, this is a lithic, this is a piece of lithic, and they would all say, no, that's not a piece of worked stone. No, es litica, yeah. And because that's just not a priority for many of the research questions about, the foundation of the first state, things like that.
I wanted to kind of start by introducing a strange thing people might notice looking at certain maps. And it has to do with a North American language family called the Na-Dene family, N-A-D-E-N-E, which encompasses a constellation of languages and dialects spoken across Alaska, the Yukon Territory of Canada, British Columbia, and then a couple little spots along the west coast.
Yep.
And then after a gap of like 1,000 miles, they'll find another big chunk of color.
Yep.
From Arizona, Utah, and Colorado all the way down to the southern end of Texas, the Western Apache and Navajo peoples speak very closely related languages that are also part of the Na-Dene family. And it's kind of a big mystery how they ended up thousands of miles away from the main bulk of Na-Dene speakers. And so I guess before we get to how one group of Dene people ended up so far from all of the other Dene people, I guess first of all, when might that have happened approximately? Mm. And then maybe let's try to talk about what there was in Alaska before that happened.
Yeah, so in terms of the timing of that migration, or probably migrations, plural, because as you point out, there are a couple of different areas today south of Canada. There's kind of two pockets of people, and it's difficult to determine, based on the linguistic evidence we have, the precise timing, and especially whether or not those migrations were one or two different waves of people. I think today, conventionally, people think it was two different but closely related in time waves of migration. Yeah. And more work really needs to be done with the descendant communities in both places in order to better understand that. We do know from the timing, it's really a great exercise in the ways archaeology and linguistics can have significant overlap, because we know that there are certain kinds of technology that are associated with the so-called Dene or Athabascan transition, which probably also was followed by this migration. So there are certain kinds of technology that appear between 1,500 and 2,000 years ago. And we know that across Dene and Athabascan-speaking peoples, the terms for those technologies are the same.
Right.
So that means, or very similar. So that means that we had a singular population of Dene-speaking peoples in one place developing copper tools, developing ceramic technology, and particularly bow and arrow technology is where a lot of this vocabulary comes from. And so we know that since they all share very similar words for bow and arrow technology, they must have been together when that technology was developed. So that's the timing aspect is based on the material record and when do we find the first bows and arrows and when do we find the first copper technology, and all of that happens at least around 1,200 years ago.
And so the Athabascan transition, the Dene transition, precedes this migration.
Yeah.
But then what's the world then before that transition happens? The Northern Archaic, right?
Yeah. So it's this sort of, I guess you could call it a late Northern Archaic, because, we like to talk about the late Archaic and the lower 48. So we can kludge that together up there too, I guess. And the real trick about it is that we don't know very much about what's happening between 4 and 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, part of why I ask is now, having dipped my toe in the water of Alaskan archaeology and having read journal articles about the Northern Archaic, I still don't feel like I know what it is very well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it covers, first of all, depending on who you ask, it covers such a different range of time, but also pretty big swath of time. A
big swath of time and a huge swath of place. If you're just looking at, so there's one artifact type that's consistently attributed to the Northern Archaic tradition, and it's this side-notched biface. And if you just base it on where the side-notched bifaces are found, it's basically every non-coastal area of Alaska today. So it's, and granted, some of those are surface finds, so we're not sure where they're traded, but a lot of them are found at archaeological deposits. You can find them in the southern Alaska Range. You find them at Swan Point. You find them in the Brooks Range. Yeah. So the range of this one so-called diagnostic artifact not only spans 5,000 plus years, it also spans millions of acres.
Right.
It's an incredible, it's an incredibly vague.
Yeah. And just for context, biface just refers to a particular kind of stone tool. That's what this is it's a particular kind of stone tool. But yeah, and it's found at sea level. It's found at, high elevation, upland occupations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Upland occupations. So, and you can say very little about a group of people based on a form of bifacial technology, in my opinion, at least.
It's such a vague picture. The picture that I've kind of absorbed is something like flexible, highly mobile caribou hunters.
Yes, yeah.
That's about the picture I have in my head, I think.
Yeah, and we base that on some of the earliest evidence for caribou drive lines, which there are probably a lot more out there that we just haven't identified. But the other interesting thing was something that's really striking to me now that I'm here in Wyoming is that we have these archaeological sites that represent mass kills, where people are going out of their way to target herds and to kill them en masse so that they can survive during difficult periods. Yeah. We do not see the equivalent of a caribou mass kill site in central Alaska. So we don't have bone beds, for example. And that's a kind of striking difference to me in terms of thinking about, okay, we have these highly mobile hunters who are really focused on moving caribou through these intentional pieces of architecture so that they can kill them en masse. And yet we do not see the faunal evidence for that.
Yeah.
And so that is very interesting, too, and suggests that the kind of targeted caribou hunting that they're doing is not the same kind of targeted hunting that you see on the Great Plains, for example, with bison.
Right. And what would you say is the earliest start point for the Northern Archaic?
I think
could be agreed on.
I think 7,200 calibrated years before present is the kind of agreed upon earliest.
And then the agreed upon latest would be the Dene Transition.
Probably 800 years calibrated before present is the latest date that I've heard. I don't agree with that based on my research, but it is what people say.
Okay, so at least in theory, we could have up to 6,500 years of the most vague,
exactly
descriptionless sort of story of what people's lives was like.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, if we want to talk about why is it so vague, well, the Archaic in North America in general is an enigmatic time period. You can't read any article about the Archaic archaeology without reading, it's understudied, enigmatic. Right. And it is not an exception that Alaska's Northern Archaic tradition is one that is systematically understudied. And I think part of the reason for that is the same across the continent. It's because you have these kind of bookends, right? You have the later time period, this Dene Transition time period, which is very interesting because you have these people who did
suddenly action-packed.
They did the same
technologies
thing. They used microblades for 10,000 years, and then all of a sudden there are no more microblades. So it's really fascinating from that perspective, I think. But also we have a bookend in the earlier period, which is the first people of North America.
Ice Age, mammoth hunting, megafauna.
So this poor understudied Northern Archaic period in the middle, you can't quite connect it to the peopling, and you can connect it to the later stuff, which people are becoming more and more interested in. And for great reason, you can connect it to ethnographic records. It's important for understanding the history of the region. And instead you have this sort of mysterious, foggy time period in the middle where we have really robust environmental reconstructions. We have the capacity to do a lot of really great research, but people just are not doing it.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you that when I started working on my dissertation, I wanted to focus on the 5,000 to 6,000 year time period because we see some interesting environmental changes happening at that time. It's an understudied time period.
Yeah.
And the deciding factor that made me work on the Dene Athabascan transition was actually radiocarbon dates.
Just the availability of them.
No, I was working at a site that we assumed was Northern Archaic based on the lithic technology. Yeah. It was microblades.
Yeah.
And then we radiocarbon dated it, and it was actually an early Dene transition period site.
Well, that's a good kind of inflection point for the conversation. I guess to start with, microblades are little, thin, rectangular razor blades of obsidian, chert, other stone tool materials, usually punched off of a core of workable material, often like a little prism-shaped, multi-sided thing that people have put a lot of effort into shaping. And you can... These blades that you punch off of that core, you can slot them into the grooved edge of a bone or a wooden item like the head of a spear, so that when they break, they're easily replaceable. It's very efficient, very valuable technology. So that was a dominant technology for a really long time. But as you point out, it actually persists following the Dene transition.
Yeah.
And the sort of dominant view has been one that relies on a sudden, momentous change.
Right.
Which is, I'm not sure what the theory is called, actually, but it's based on the White River Ash event.
Yes.
Is it just the White River Ash event hypothesis or something? Or
yeah, I mean, I usually say it's the volcanic explanation.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's like an agreed upon formal term. And I think it's interesting that we've spent this much time talking and we're just now getting to the volcano, which is great. Because typically it goes the other way around. Yeah, so the volcanic eruption, there were actually 2 eruptions emanating from the Wrangell-St. Elias range during the last 2,000 years. But it's the second one, the later one, that people attribute to what you say is like an immediate shift in what lithics people are using, how they're using them, and what they're eating, how they're living, things like that.
And so the story is basically this eruption, which I guess people should picture basically like the bottom right corner of mainland Alaska. Visually.
Yeah, mostly in Canada, honestly, like Yukon territory. Yeah, bottom right corner, so Wrangell-St. Elias, and then emanating. They found ash as far east as Greenland from this eruption.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was a pretty big deal. And that's actually how they were able to date it so well because it's preserved in Greenland ice cores.
Oh, wow. And so the volcano erupts, it devastates the environment?
Presumably.
And then that puts more pressure on people to change what they're doing in terms of how they're getting food, how much they're moving around between village sites, presumably, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think that the general or hypothetical explanation kind of goes that suddenly there's a big decline in caribou populations, which is recorded in some population genetic data for caribou herds in the region, mostly the region that's kind of spanning the Alaska-Canada border.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about a group of people, the Northern Archaic, as we just discussed, is, at least for the moment, we think very dependent on caribou hunting. So this group of people no longer can hunt caribou as an option. So if this is a prolonged environmental perturbation, like if this is some climate change that's taking, or environmental change that's lasting for several years, the idea is that people would have had to move in with their neighbors to make it work. And so maybe they moved in with the coastal Tlingit, Yak, Haida. These are distant relatives of the Athabascan language family that would have been known to people in the interior. They live on the coast. They live in villages. They hunt. They fish. And they supplement their fishing with some terrestrial game.
Yeah.
And they use metal technology, they use bows and arrows, they use pottery. And so the idea is that they went into these neighboring communities and they saw what they were doing, and then they lived there for a generation maybe, and they moved back. And they basically, this idea is premised upon the timing, but it's also premised upon movement of artifacts or the lack of movement of artifacts immediately following the volcanic eruption. So that's this lithic sourcing data kind of a study.
What do you mean by that?
So essentially, there's been some work out of Canada, which is really great, that shows how artifacts are moving around immediately before and immediately after the volcanic eruption in terms of portable X-ray fluorescence. So trying to get an idea of the chemical composition of these artifacts. And then showing where they're moving to see that are people getting more material from these coastal communities immediately after the volcanic eruption, as you would expect based on this sort of overarching framework for this hypothesis. And that is sort of what we see. There is a convincing argument for that. And I don't think there's any reason to doubt that people would have done that in a limited capacity for some period of time. The issue is that we see the material transition before the volcanic eruption, so the timing just doesn't make any sense at all.
Right. And that kind of goes to the alternative, just slow population increase.
Yeah.
Triggers these changes, right?
Absolutely. So in the alternative hypothesis, which I kind of stumbled upon or gravitated towards in my research because I was looking at some probability distributions of radiocarbon dates and seeing that it really does look like there are more people in the last 2,000 years of Alaskan history than there are in the preceding periods. And so that kind of led me to think, like, are there just more sites? Are people just changing the way they live on the landscape? Are we actually seeing more people on the ground? And so I did a study of how large sites were and compared that to how many sites we have. And not only does the number of sites increase significantly, the size of sites also increases significantly.
Right. So it's not just like they used to be more coalesced or they became more coalesced.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of what led me to think about how would people change the way they live based on more people being on the landscape versus less resources being available to, a similar number of people on the landscape.
Yeah.
And again, you don't want to, like, there are many ways that these could be overlapping issues, of course. Populations were increasing. The volcanic eruption did happen. They may have both had some kind of effect.
Right, yeah, it doesn't have to be unicausal.
Exactly.
So how could you then distinguish between those two variables archaeologically?
Yeah, so this is something that I worked very hard on when I was working on my NSF proposal during my PhD. How could we say that it was a volcano or a population increase? How can you actually tell the difference between those effects on a group of people? And one of the biggest, there's a lot of other tiny material correlates that I won't get into because it's kind of boring. But one of the biggest things is that with an increase in population, it's gradual.
Yeah.
And so you'll see compensation for that increase in population that's also gradual. You're not going to see a whole full-scale change in every single thing all at once, as you would anticipate if there was a catastrophic environmental event that destroyed your dietary, basically the primary source of your dinner.
Yeah.
So
that's something that's probably worth touching on also, I think, because I can kind of remember in undergrad finding some of the buzzwords that people use for talking about hunter-gatherers a little boring. And
right.
One of the ones that's a classic is subsistence.
Right.
But I think part of it is a bias as a modern person, because I can just go to a supermarket and buy like a pre-cooked meal.
Yeah.
And I don't have to think about it. And it could have, like, the supply chains involved in that food could be from like 4 different countries on 3 continents. And
absolutely.
And I would never know. But if you're a mobile foraging person, it's direct. You have like a direct relationship with everything that you've eaten, whether it's someone that you know who procured the food or you did it yourself.
Right.
You have to have a really intricate understanding of the natural world around you. And it also is very immediate need, right? Like
right.
You're always processing something, or you're always going out and harvesting something. And so I think people take for granted not having to think about food as like one of the most sort of fundamental organizing principles of their life.
I totally agree, and I think that's an interesting way of putting it. And I've thought about the same thing for technology. Like we very much take for granted the different technologies that we use. For example, everyone uses the toilet several times a day, and I bet nobody could build one. And that's another aspect of life that is can be comprised within what you eat for dinner, but it is separate from that and requires also very intentional going about the world and making the things that you need to survive in it, and knowing that you can survive in it. And I don't want to make it sound like life wasn't precarious in this environment, as it is in all environments, especially when you live a highly mobile lifestyle if you're moving around all the time.
Yeah.
And we know that there were starvation periods, and we know that people died because they could not get enough to eat, and it was not infrequent. You see that consistently in oral histories.
Right.
You hear it consistently in ethnographic records. It's certainly true that this was a very difficult place to make it, and that sometimes all that knowledge that a person has just doesn't work out.
What do we see happen to people's diets over the course of this transition?
Yeah, so this is something that was one of the hardest pieces to tease out for me, because we have such a limited record of animal bones in the interior, which is the conventional way that people would reconstruct what people are eating. You know, you have the bones.
You dig up their village, you count all the bones.
Yep.
And then you say there's 30% large mammals and there's 30%, small game, and there's fur-bearing animals and blah, blah, blah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You find the bone bed, and then you count all the stuff in it. And in central Alaska, it's just bone confetti. And so if you are looking for evidence, especially evidence for things like hair, snowshoe hair, things like fish.
Right. Like if a moose femur gets pounded into confetti, then what's going to happen to the fish bone?
Exactly.
At the site?
Yeah. And it's also still kind of unclear whether the state of the faunal remains is due to taphonomy or due to, I guess you could say, cultural taphonomy.
Yeah.
With people trying to clean up, trying to reduce waste, or trying to process bones into grease rendering, or other things. I mean, you can make pigments out of calcined bone too. So there's a lot of different reasons why you crush up a bunch of bones into tiny little bits.
Right.
And I don't think we've quite unraveled that yet. People have said that it's due to the acidic soils of the boreal region, but in this in this research that I've done, actually doing sediment pH sampling, it doesn't really seem like that has any bearing on the state of faunal remains that we find.
And so we had people who were throughout the Northern Archaic mobile caribou hunters.
Yes.
And then they become less mobile?
Yes.
They start eating other things?
Yes. So, yes, we already, before I started this research, the idea was that people were fishing. That's the biggest thing that happens during the transition, the Dene Athabascan transition, is that all of a sudden people are fishing and they're doing it in a big way. So it's potentially even intensified fishing, that they're going out of their way to build different technologies to live in different ways so that they can procure massive amounts of fish, which is what you see in the ethnographic period. And that's, I think, part of the reason why that connection was made.
And then so they're becoming more specialized. They're fishing more.
Yep.
The population is increasing. I guess maybe not as much as people might have argued in the past, but there's some shift away from microblade technology.
Yeah, so it definitely seems like a more gradual transition than people had previously argued, because I have microblade technology persisting until about 500 or 600 years ago. So it's
so hundreds of years after the kind of moment of sudden catastrophe and instant change.
Exactly. And so, part of the problem is if you only are drawing from a couple of sites, the evidence is going to look more black and white than if you start drawing from a larger comparative population of sites. So we really still need more data on that. But yes, the biggest part of what I found was that the transition in technology and in subsistence was much more gradual and overlapping than what had previously been argued.
So if the population was increasing for hundreds of years prior to the sort of the volcano moment, do you have any theories for why that would have been? Is that even possible to get at archaeologically?
For what? Why would it?
For why population's growing in the first place?
Oh, yeah. So this is an interesting piece that I can't say 100% either way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so essentially there is this wrinkle in Athabascan or Dene linguistic terminology. It's based on a Dravidian kinship system. Like if you go way back into your intro to cultural anthropology class, they might have talked about different ways that people make relationships with each other. And essentially it's a very regulated system with very limited possibilities for potential marriage partners. And in one interpretation or sort of one formation of the language and the kinship terminology allows you to only make marriages with people outside of your clan, moiety, etc., of which there are several different conflicting levels in Dene kinship. So it's a very complicated setting.
Yeah.
But essentially, you are not allowed, if you are a Caribou clan or an Ochre clan, you're not allowed to marry somebody within that clan. And also you got to check your moiety out, your town, and everything else. And then the other formation says that you can only marry somebody within your clan, your moiety, etc. So essentially, what Jack Ives is the person who kind of identified this really interesting wrinkle in the linguistic terminology.
Yeah.
And in his dissertation research, which he later published as a book, he suggests that if you have this more internal clan-based structure, you already know the people who are in your clan. They may not be like genetically blood related to you, right? But you know who they are, you know where they live, you know where to find them. So it's a lot easier to get those marriage partners than people who don't live in your clan.
Right.
And so that means that people are all of a sudden able to find marriage partners and reproduce a lot more easily.
That's one of the things that I think people, especially when you're dealing with archaeology rather than history or just looking at physical objects,
Right.
I think people tend to not worry about those sorts of cultural institutions as much as they ought to, because it kind of looks like a technology in cultural form in a way.
Yeah, it definitely seems kind of it's a cultural adaptation for sure.
Yeah.
And there's a functional argument for seeking marriage partners outside of your kin group, whatever that is. And again, I want to emphasize that this isn't necessarily like your cousin directly. It's like your clan cousin. There are advantages to seeking somebody outside of that, right? Because you get more knowledge, information about different parts of the landscape.
Right.
You meet new people. You you get new stories, you get new access to different resources.
Right, which seems to blend well with this story of really highly mobile hunters.
Exactly. And people who maintain cultural consistency over an incredibly large landscape and linguistic consistency too. So there's definitely, and we see this also if you want to do a cross-cultural comparison, and in the Western Desert of Australia, Aboriginal people have very similarly complex kinship systems that ensure that you are meeting people far and away removed from your social group.
Yeah.
And in a very resource-poor landscape, you can see the adaptive function of that if you want to look at it through a functional lens. So it's hard for me to give you like an origin for why they switched from one system to another. But I can say that the evidence is very suggestive that they did.
It kind of intuitively, to me at least, comes across as a much more human explanation. Not that I don't find anything convincing about the idea that the White River ash event had repercussions and could have, either exacerbated this or created a moment, like within a broader period of change, it could have created a much faster moment of change.
Right.
But if someone tried to tell me that like the Mithridatic Wars between Rome and Pontus were because of a drought, or that a volcanic eruption started the Mongol conquests or something, like that kind of explanation I find really hard to swallow.
The deforestation of the Middle Ages is what led to the Crusades or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a bunch of different, for sure.
And I think in places where we have a historical record, it's a lot easier to see what they're writing and be like, oh, that's why the Crusades happened. They have a lot of human justifications for this that are culturally contingent and based on historical context. And it wasn't just, deforestation. Now we need to go invade Holy Land.
Turned out they had too many second and third born sons and nothing to do with them, and they were causing kind of trouble in their area. So, no, absolutely. I think that I totally agree with you, and it's difficult because, as we just were talking about, these are people who depend so thoroughly on their knowledge of the environment and that being correct, that the minute the environment changes, they have to change what they're doing. Maybe they have a plan. Maybe there's an adaptive strategy already in place.
Yeah.
But maybe there's not. And so it is impossible, I think, to separate the environment as a potential cause. Like I was just talking about population increase being driven by the environment being better or more consistent or something.
Yeah.
Or maybe just the environment not changing is what allowed people to have an increase in population. And so I think that, I don't want to say it wasn't the environment at all. Like we shouldn't consider the environment. But I do think that we need to give highly mobile people who live in these environments some credit that they have intergenerational knowledge, and they have ways of preserving that knowledge and ways of, adapting, overcoming these broader environmental changes that allow them to persist. And that rather than a group of agriculturalists who are living in these urban centers, you have a drought in that scenario, they're toast.
Yeah.
It's not the same, know? And it always bothers me that we seem so ready to compare, a bar chart with radiocarbon dates on it to an environmental line, a temperature reconstruction, and sort of connect the dots and say, hey, look, there's a dip here and there's a dip here, great. And there's no other explanation needed.
Done.
Yeah.
Story ended.
And when, like you said, people are rich in their knowledge of their environment. They are rich in the ways that they interact with each other and the strategies that they build. And they can't, it's just, it seems reductive to just attribute it to a potential dip in temperature, things like that.
It feels to me like some of the challenge in not thinking in such a sort of desaturated way is, again, back to just how little there often is in the record. Like the field work that I was doing last summer, searching for sites along the Yukon River. How the work looked as we would trek 3 miles through tussocky tundra.
Right.
Dig a half dozen shovel test pits.
Yeah.
On like a high promontory where maybe hopefully somebody once was there for some reason.
In the same place you're digging the hole.
And then find nothing in the hole because you're completely shooting blind in the dark.
Yeah.
Or find like one flake of gray chert. And then keep hiking and then do it again later.
Right.
Or even with an archaeological site, like find a stain of ash and then a pile of stone chips.
Yeah.
And then 3 broken pieces of a caribou
Right.
leg. It's just so hard to go from that to like in the Museum of the North, some of the clothing they have on display that Dene people wore, things like that, like the amount of color and detail that we can't see.
You know, you have to know what to look for too. You have to ask the right questions in order to find the right things. Like I learned about bird bone straws this summer because I found a radius of a swan, and it's a straw. It's basically the epiphyses are removed and it's just the diaphysis, and it's probably at least 13,000 years old, and it's a really beautiful artifact. And you're thinking, like, why are these people who are living in this essentially a desert 13,000 years ago, why are they interested in making straws?
Yeah.
And when I looked in the dictionary of a Koyukon Athabascan dictionary, bird bone straws are strongly associated with female puberty rites. And in fact, to contain the magic that girls have when they first menstruate, they can't touch the water directly with their mouth. They have to drink it through a straw. And so they have a necklace that they wear with the straw around their neck at all times, just to make sure they're not poisoning the environment essentially with their magic. And so that's something I never would have thought to look for in the archaeological record, to think about. And, you know, it could be evidence that there's this really consistent tradition of women, gender, magic, etc., ritual that's going back 13,000 years.
Yeah.
And there are other things we can look for that are taboo for girls who are menstruating in order to think about that site as a potential, you know, the area where girls would go to have their first period, essentially. And
that's really cool.
For a group of highly mobile people, you know, you think 13,000 years ago, you're barely picturing humans at all. You're just sort of like these fur-covered lumps that are just trying to eke out their existence. And instead, I mean, they were for sure using a straw. I can't tell you that it was for this elaborate puberty ritual or not, but it's very clear that they're developing the same cultural complex systems that we assume every human group would develop.
Yeah. Like in another example, there's a book by Ernest Birch called Alliance and Conflict, The World System of the Inupiaq Eskimos, where he provides ethnographic accounts of native warfare in northern Alaska, and he points out that anthropologists would often read these conflicts as petty or insignificant, but to the participants it was just as important as modern wars between nation states.
I cannot tell you how irritated I get when people talk about complex hunter-gatherers as if they are something other than, you know, the normal humdrum, like, simple hunter-gatherers. It makes me so frustrated. And to say that these people who maintained the same material technology, the same linguistic terminology for 10,000 years in this region are simple, it just drives me nuts.
Yeah.
And I love that you bring in the defense and the warfare, because that is something that I also associated with this increase in population size, because essentially as populations are increasing, you're becoming more territorial. That's consistently what you see in the ethnographic record. And every time I presented this research during my dissertation proposal, during my defense, people would always say, it's ridiculous. You can't imagine that these highly mobile people had defensive orientations. There's so much territory. How could you be territorial? And it shows a complete lack of imagination, in my opinion.
Like lacking the imagination to give people the full spectrum of what people tend to be.
Absolutely.
Like I always get really tired by the prehistoric warfare debate because it so often ends up in this weird sort of Hobbesian, Rousseauian battleground of like either people went from like Edenic purity to vile civilization, or they went from Hobbesian chaos to civilized order, and like in either direction there's clearly like a moral line. It's like you're either going up or down morally, but people have always been the same thing that we are. It just like our context and our technologies and our population densities and things like that can shift, but like we're still human in either case, and I think it's so easy with especially foraging people and hunter-gatherers to, in one direction or the other, they tend to get like pieces of that humanity kind of pulled away, you know? Yeah,
I agree. I think it's partially because we just don't think to look for it, and partially because we don't have the tools.
Yeah.
And so my thinking in my research is how can we get the tools we need to look for those things that we are missing? How can we think about, you have Bantu migration in Africa. Like, how can we think about that migration from a similar theoretical framework as the one we have in Alaska? It's groups of highly mobile people moving across these landscapes. How can we model these in ways that make it so we're not just saying, oh, it's because it got cold and people left?
Yeah.
Or, there's no volcano in that situation, so, like, what do you do?
Yeah.
And instead of shying away from that complexity, thinking about how you can really embrace it. And I hope that somebody follows up on my research and says, actually, that's not quite the full picture. Here's some other stuff.
Yeah.
But already, just trying to embrace more complexity than a volcano would boom and everybody went, and ran away.
On these types of topics, what kind of work do we need more of, in your opinion?
That's a great question. I think about this a lot. I think for sure, as we just talked about, we need to look at the Northern Archaic more seriously and have all of those components that have been so rigorously excavated by so many different teams of researchers that are just sitting on a shelf because they were not related to the period of interest. We needed to look at those and we need to reanalyze those. I think that we also need to figure out ways to incorporate the dietary information, to assess the dietary information, and to really model it well. I also think I'm writing a paper right now about shovel testing versus auger surveys. I think we really need to start doing more auger surveys in the interior.
Yeah. If
we want to find sites that are below 1 meter deep, you cannot use a shovel test. And
I can't use my 1 meter long shovel.
No. So, there's some very material, tangible things like using an auger instead of a shovel, and then some more, kind of bigger abstract stuff like how do we model these more social, complex cultural behaviors at deeper periods in the past.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing is that we have not used the ethnographic record and the living descendant communities, the resources and the knowledge that they carry with them. I don't think that knowledge has really been adequately tapped into.
Yeah.
And so I'm so glad that you talked to Jared and Evie, because that's a great collaboration, and Evie is a great steward for those conversations about traditional knowledge. And she's so frustrated, and rightly so, for the things archaeologists will tell her, that she's like, that's so stupid.
So just talk to people is a good starting rule. It's like, talk to Dene people.
Yeah, talk to some of the living descendant communities. And the concerns that they have about their livelihood today is influenced by thousands of years of tradition. And so how could that not be relevant to archaeologists?
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time, Bri.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. I appreciate it and having it.
And thank you for listening to this episode of The Tell. Until next time.